The coffee pot was still half full when Amara Whitfield noticed the ring. She had worked the morning shift at Della's diner for 2 years now, long enough to read a table before she reached it, long enough to know that the man in the back booth by the window was not the kind of customer this town usually saw. He sat alone, back straight, jacket cut close enough to his shoulders that it had clearly never come off a rack, and his hands were folded on the table with a stillness that made her think of a held breath. She approached with the pot because that was her job, because rent was due Friday and tips didn't collect themselves, and she poured his coffee without looking at his face the way she'd trained herself not to look too long at customers who felt like trouble. That was when she saw it. A ring on his right hand, heavy gold, a black stone set deep in the center with a thin engraved line running around its edge, like a signature only certain eyes were meant to read. Her hand stopped moving. Coffee kept pouring for half a second too long, spilling hot over the rim of the cup and onto his knuckles, and he did not flinch, did not pull his hand back, only watched her with dark eyes that had gone very sharp very fast. "I'm so sorry," she said, grabbing a napkin, and then, before she could stop the words, before the sensible part of her brain caught up to her mouth, she said the thing that changed everything. "Sir, my mother has a ring like yours." He went still in a way that was different from before, a stillness that had teeth in it. "What did you say?" he said, and his voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that made the whole diner feel smaller. "Nothing, I'm sorry, it's not my business," Amara said quickly, wiping at the spilled coffee, cursing herself internally for opening her mouth at all. But his hand moved, not fast, not threatening, just enough to stop her wiping motion, his fingers closing loosely around her wrist for one measured second before releasing her entirely. "Tell me what you meant," he said, "by that." She straightened, aware suddenly of every eye in the diner that wasn't actually looking at them, aware of the way his presence had rearranged the air in the room the second he'd walked in an hour ago and ordered black coffee and nothing else. "It's just a ring my mother kept," Amara said carefully. "Gold, black stone, the same little engraved line around the edge. She never told me where it came from. She just said it belonged to someone she used to know, someone from before I was born, and she wore it exactly twice a year and put it away the rest of the time like it scared her to look at it too long." The man's jaw tightened, the first crack she'd seen in the composure. He wore like a second jacket. "Your mother's name," he said. "It wasn't a request." "Vivian," Amara said. "Vivian Whitfield." Something moved behind his eyes, fast and unreadable, gone before she could name it, but she saw enough of it to understand that she had just said something that mattered more than she knew. His name was Jae Sun Moon, though she wouldn't learn that for another hour, and by the time she did, she would already understand that the ring on his hand was not decoration. It was a mark of blood, a signet that belonged to exactly one family in a city 300 miles from this diner, a family that controlled the ports and the warehouses, and half the quiet arrangements that kept certain businesses running smooth and certain debts paid on time, whether the people who owed them wanted to pay or not. He had come to this small town for reasons that had nothing to do with the diner waitress, tracking a lead on a man who owed his organization a debt too large to ignore, and he had stopped here only because the coffee at the gas station 3 miles back had tasted like motor oil, and he needed to think clearly before the meeting waiting for him tonight. He had not expected the name Vivian Whitfield to detonate quietly in his chest like something buried finally coming up for air. "Sit down," he said, and when Amara hesitated, glancing toward the counter where her manager was watching with open curiosity, he added more evenly, "Please. I will make it worth the interruption." She sat because something in the request had shifted from command to something closer to need, and because 21 years of instinct told her that whatever was happening here mattered more than the tables she was supposed to be turning. 22 years ago, Jae Sun said, choosing each word like it cost him something to spend, "I gave that ring to a woman. Her name was Vivian. She left before I could stop her, and I have not been able to find her since, no matter how many resources I have spent trying." Amara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of understanding that the story of her own life had a chapter she had never been shown. "My mother left Seoul before I was born," she said slowly. "She never talked about it. Not once. Not who my father was, not why she left, nothing." Jae Sun's hand closed into a fist on the table, controlled, deliberate, the kind of stillness she would come to recognize as the loudest thing about him. "Then I believe," he said, "that we have a great deal to discuss." That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them understood yet how far the ground would shift beneath them before the night was through. Amara's shift ended at 3, and Jae-sun waited the entire time in the back booth, drinking coffee he barely touched, watching her move through the diner with an attention that made her skin prickle every time she passed his table. When she finally untied her apron and sat across from him in the empty booth after close, the manager gone home, the afternoon light slanting gold through the diner windows, he told her the truth in pieces, careful and measured, the way a man tells a story he has rehearsed alone in the dark for years without ever expecting to say it aloud. He told her he had loved Vivian Whitfield the way a person loves something they know they should not want, a foreign exchange student who had spent a year in Seoul studying design, who had wandered into a restaurant his family owned without knowing what the name over the door truly meant, who had made him laugh in a way nobody in his world had managed before or since. He told her his father had discovered the relationship and threatened Vivian directly, not with violence exactly, but with the kind of pressure a powerful family applies when they want something to disappear quietly, and that Vivian had vanished 1 week later without a word, without an address, without anything but the ring he had given her still somehow in her possession when she left. "I searched for years," he said, quietly, because a search like that draws attention I could not afford at the time. Eventually the search became something I did instead of grieving, and then it became something I stopped doing because grief, apparently, does end, even when you do not want it to. Amara sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold, trying to reconcile the mother she knew, careful and closed off and quick to change the subject whenever men or Korea or the years before Amara's birth came up in conversation, with a young woman in this story, running from a family powerful enough to make people disappear from a life instead of just a room. "If you're right," Amara said slowly, "if I am who you think I might be, that makes you." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because the shape of it was too large to hold in her mouth. "It makes me a man who needs a very simple answer to a very simple question," Jae-sun said, his eyes steady on hers in a way that felt like being measured and found, for the first time in a long while, not lacking. "Would you be willing to meet her with me? To ask her the truth together?" "She's 3 states away," Amara said. "She won't answer a call from a strange number, let alone open her door to explain the last 22 years to a man she ran from." He looked at her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes, the machinery of a man who had spent his life solving problems that other people considered unsolvable. "Then we will not call," he said. "We will go to her. Tonight, if you are willing." Amara should have said no. Every practical part of her, the part that paid rent on time and kept her head down and had learned the hard way that trusting strangers rarely ended well, told her to walk away from this booth and this ring and this man with eyes like closed doors finally cracking open. But there was another part of her, quieter and more stubborn, that had spent 21 years wondering about the silence where her father should have been, and that part of her was already standing, already reaching for her coat. "I need to grab my things," she said. "And you need to understand something before we go anywhere together. If you're lying to me, if this is some kind of setup, I will make you regret it." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "I do not lie," he said. "It is one of the very few things my world has left me incapable of." She believed him, not because she was naive, but because she had spent 2 years reading liars across a diner counter, and this man carried none of the tells. What she did not yet understand was that the very fact of his honesty, his stillness, his careful, controlled presence, was itself a kind of danger, the sort that did not announce itself with raised voices or quick hands, but with the quiet gravity of a man used to being obeyed. The drive took most of the night, Jae-sun's black car cutting through empty highway, while Amara sat rigid in the passenger seat, watching the man beside her with the wary attention of someone who had agreed to something enormous, without fully understanding its shape. He drove the way he did everything, precise and economical, hands steady on the wheel, and somewhere around midnight, with the radio low and the road empty ahead of them, he told her more, filling in the edges of a story that had haunted him for over 2 decades. He told her about his father, dead 6 years now, and about the organization he had inherited, an empire built on shipping routes and quiet arrangements that most of the country never saw and never needed to. He told her, carefully, in language stripped of romance, that his world was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with fiction, that men who worked for families like his lived and sometimes died by decisions made in rooms she would never be invited into, and that if she truly was his daughter, that fact alone would make her a target for anyone who wanted leverage against him. "You're telling me this because you want me to be afraid," Amara said, watching the dark trees blur past the window. "I am telling you this," Jae-sun said, "because you deserve the truth before you decide whether you want any part of what I am offering you. I have already lost one person I loved to secrets I kept for what I believed were good reasons. I do not intend to repeat that mistake with my own child, if that is what you are." The word child sat strange and heavy in the car between them, too large for either of them to fully hold yet, and Amara turned to look out the window rather than answer, her throat tight with something she refused to name until she understood it better herself. They found her mother's house just after 2 a.m, a small brick home on a quiet street in a city Amara had visited exactly twice in her life, both times for funerals. The porch light was on, the way it always was, because Vivian Whitfield had never once in Amara's memory gone to sleep with the house dark, a habit Amara had never questioned until this exact moment, standing on the walkway beside a man who might be her father, wondering for the first time if that habit had less to do with comfort and more to do with a woman who had spent over 2 decades watching the dark for something she was afraid might finally arrive. Vivian opened the door before they knocked, standing in the doorway in a robe with her hair pulled back, and the moment her eyes landed on Jae-sun, every drop of color left her face. "No," she said, quiet and immediate, already stepping back like she meant to close the door on 22 years of careful distance. "Mama," Amara said, and something in her daughter's voice stopped Vivian's hand on the door entirely. "I need you to tell me the truth.
Right now.
Tonight. I'm tired of the silence." Vivian looked between the two of them for a long, unbearable moment, her eyes moving from Jae-sun's face to Amara's and back again, cataloging something Amara couldn't read, and then she stepped back from the door, not in surrender exactly, but in the exhausted recognition of a woman who understood that the thing she had spent her whole adult life running from had finally, inevitably, caught up to her. Inside, under the harsh kitchen light, Vivian told the truth in a voice scraped raw with the effort of finally releasing it. She confirmed everything Jae-sun had said and added the piece he did not know, the piece that explained 22 years of silence more completely than any of them had expected. She had not simply left Seoul out of fear for herself. Jae-sun's father had made a specific and unmistakable threat, not against Vivian, but against the child she had just discovered she was carrying, a warning delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had removed inconvenient problems from his path before and would do so again without hesitation. Vivian had run not to protect herself, but to protect the daughter she had not yet met, disappearing into a country and a life where the name Moon meant nothing to anyone, raising Amara alone on a waitress's wages and a design certificate she'd never gotten to use, because the alternative had been a threat she could not risk testing. "I told myself every single day that I made the right choice," Vivian said, her hands wrapped so tightly around her coffee mug that her knuckles had gone pale. "And every single day, some small, stupid, hopeful part of me wondered if I had simply thrown away the best thing that ever happened to me out of fear that never had to come true." Jae-sun sat very still through all of it, and Amara watched something break open behind his composed exterior, watched 22 years of careful control crack under the weight of a truth he had waited half his life to hear. "My father is dead," he said finally, quietly. "He has been dead 6 years. Whatever threat he made, whatever fear you carried, it does not have to live in this house anymore. Threats like that don't just die with the man who made them," Vivian said, and there was something old and tired in her voice, something that had been carrying weight for far too long. "They live in the organization he built, in the people who remember what he was willing to do. Then I will make certain," Jae-sun said, "that everyone who remembers understands the world has changed." It was a promise easily made, and Amara would soon learn, far harder to keep, because the truth had a way of traveling faster and further than any of them intended, and by the following evening, word had already reached people in Jae-sun's world who had no interest in watching an old and inconvenient secret transform quietly into a new and legitimate heir. The first sign of trouble arrived 2 days later, when Amara did not recognize idled too long outside her apartment while she was walking home from a shift she'd insisted on finishing despite Jae-sun's clear discomfort with her returning to work at all. She noticed it the way he had unknowingly trained her to notice things in the short time she'd known him, the engine too quiet for the neighborhood, the windows tinted darker than seemed reasonable, and she called him the moment she was safely inside, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay where you are," Jae-sun said, and she could hear the shift in him even over the phone, the same controlled stillness sliding into something colder and more purposeful. "Do not open the door for anyone. I am coming now." He arrived in less time than the drive should have taken, and when he stepped into her small apartment, he was no longer the composed, careful man who had sat across from her mother's kitchen table. This was the version of him that had built and defended an empire for 6 years, sharp-eyed and economical in his movements, checking her windows and door locks with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before and hoped never to need the skill again. "Someone in the organization does not want a new heir to complicate existing arrangements," he said. "There are men who have spent years positioning themselves to inherit influence they believe should be theirs. Your existence threatens that whether you asked for the threat or not." "So what do we do?" Amara said, and she noticed distantly that she had said we without thinking twice about it. "We do nothing reckless," he said. "You stay close to me until this settles, or you disappear the way your mother did, and I will not ask that of you unless there is no other choice." "I'm not disappearing," Amara said, and there was something fierce in her own voice that surprised her. "I just found out who my father is. I'm not running from that to make someone else's ambitions easier." The danger sharpened 3 days later, in a parking garage outside the restaurant where Jae-sun had arranged to meet Amara for dinner, a public place chosen deliberately because he had believed public would mean safe. He was wrong, and Amara understood exactly how wrong the moment 2 men stepped out from between parked cars as they crossed toward the elevator, their intent unmistakable in the way they spread apart to block both possible directions of retreat. Jae-sun moved before she fully registered the threat, placing his body between her and the nearer man with a fluid economy that told her everything about the years he'd spent surviving a world built on exactly this kind of violence. "Get behind the pillar," he said, low and fast, and she moved because his voice left no room for argument, but she did not simply hide the way he clearly expected her to. She had grown up watching her mother handle difficult men at a diner counter with nothing but a coffee pot and sharp words, had learned early that stillness and invisibility could be their own kind of weapon, and when the second man circled wide to flank Jae-sun from behind while his attention was locked on the first threat, Amara did the only thing she could think to do. She grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted beside the pillar, wrenched it free, and swung it hard into the back of the flanking man's knees, sending him crashing forward with a shout that gave Jae-sun the half-second of warning he needed to turn and finish what the man had started. It was over in under a minute, both men disarmed and bleeding on the concrete, and Jae-sun turned to find Amara standing with the fire extinguisher still gripped white-knuckled in her hands, breathing hard, her eyes wide but steady. "You could have been killed," he said, closing the distance between them. "So could you," she said. "I wasn't about to stand behind a pillar and just hope you won." Something in his face shifted then, something that had been guarded even through the truth of her mother's kitchen table, something that finally, fully opened. "You are exactly like her," he said quietly, "and exactly unlike anyone else I have ever known." The confession that followed came not in a moment of romance, but in the raw aftermath of violence, both of them standing in a parking garage with adrenaline still burning through their blood, and Amara understood, with sudden and total clarity, that what she felt for this man was not simply the complicated tangle of a daughter meeting a father for the first time. It was something else entirely, something that had no clean name and made her deeply uneasy even as she recognized its truth. "I need to say something," she said, "and I need you to understand it isn't easy for me to say it." Jae-sun waited, still and attentive in the way that had become familiar to her over these strange, compressed days. "I don't know what you are to me," Amara said. "Father, stranger, something else. I genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty terrifies me more than the men who just try to hurt us. But I know that when I saw that ring on your hand 3 days ago, something in me recognized you before I understood why. And I know that standing here right now, I am not thinking about you as my father. I don't know what that means, and I don't know what to do with it, but I refuse to lie to you about it." Jae-sun's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, the silence between them thick with a truth neither of them had been prepared to name. "The blood test my people are running will tell us the truth in a matter of days," he said finally, his voice rough with something he was clearly working hard to control. "Until then, I will not allow either of us to act on anything that truth might complicate. But I will tell you this. You are the first person since your mother who has made me feel like something other than a title. Whatever the results say, that will remain true, and we will have to decide together what to do with it." It was not a declaration. It was not even close. But it was honest, raw, and unfinished, and Amara understood that honesty, in his world, was worth more than any romantic promise could have been. The results arrived 4 days later, delivered quietly by a Dr. Jae-sun trusted completely, and the answer, when it came, complicated everything and clarified nothing all at once. The test was unmistakable. Jae-sun Moon was not Amara's father. The timeline, once properly examined against Vivian's careful and painful memory, revealed a truth she herself had never fully questioned, protected for over 2 decades by grief and guilt that had made her assume the worst possible story rather than examine the actual dates. Vivian had already been several weeks along when she and Jae-sun's relationship reached its final and most reckless point, a fact she had never known because she had left Seoul in fear and shame before any test could have told her differently, and had simply assumed, in the desperate logic of a frightened 20-year-old, that the timeline matched the man she loved rather than the brief and forgettable relationship that had actually preceded him. Amara's biological father, whoever he had been, was a stranger neither of them would ever know, a footnote in a story that had reshaped itself entirely around a truth nobody had expected. Jae-sun sat across from Amara in her small apartment when the results came, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, both absorbing a truth that dismantled the framework they had spent nearly 2 weeks building their understanding around. "I don't know what this means," Amara said finally, and her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. "It means," Jae-sun said slowly, "that everything I felt for you these past weeks was never complicated by the thing I feared it was complicated by. It means the recognition you spoke of in that parking garage was never confusion. It was simply truth, arriving before either of us had the facts to understand it correctly." Amara looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the careful, guarded man she'd first met across a diner table, and found instead something unguarded and certain, something that had been circling closer to the surface since the moment she'd spilled coffee across his knuckles 2 weeks ago. "You're saying you're not my father," she said slowly, testing the shape of the words. "I am saying," Jae-sun said, closing the distance between them with the same deliberate certainty he brought to everything, "that I am free, for the first time in this entire situation, to want exactly what I have wanted since the night I drove you to your mother's door, and could not stop watching the way you refused to be afraid of me." The threat from within his organization did not simply dissolve because the family question had resolved itself, and Jae-sun understood, even as something long frozen in his chest finally began to thaw, that the men who had attacked them in the parking garage represented a faction that would not stand down simply because the immediate provocation had turned out to be a misunderstanding of timeline and biology. The following week brought the true confrontation, arranged not by Jae-sun but by the faction leader himself, a man named Sung-ho, who had served Jae-sun's father for decades and had grown resentful watching a younger man inherit an empire he believed he understood better. Sung-ho summoned Jae-sun to a meeting under the pretense of resolving the matter peacefully, a meeting Jae-sun agreed to attend specifically because he understood that refusing would only delay a confrontation that needed to happen regardless. Amara insisted on coming, And when Jae-sun refused, citing danger too significant to risk, she reminded him with a directness he had come to recognize as entirely her own that she had already proven, in a parking garage with nothing but a fire extinguisher, that she was not a woman who waited safely on the sidelines while people she cared about faced danger alone. "I am not asking your permission," she said. "I am telling you I am coming, and you can either plan around that fact or waste time arguing with me that we do not have." He looked at her for a long moment, something that might have been pride moving behind his dark eyes. "You would have made a formidable soldier," he said. "I would have made a formidable soldier's downfall," she said. "I don't follow orders I disagree with. Let's go." The meeting took place in a private room above a restaurant Sung-ho controlled, and the moment Jae-sun and Amara walked in together, the calculation in Sung-ho's expression shifted, recalibrating around a variable he had clearly not planned for. "You brought the girl," he said, his eyes moving over Amara with open assessment. "I was under the impression she was no longer a complication to this organization's succession, given the results of the test I understand you commissioned." "She is not a complication," Jae-sun said, his voice dropping into the flat, cold register Amara had heard only once before, in the moments before violence. "She is under my protection, and any further move against her will be treated as a move against me directly, regardless of what the blood test revealed." Sung-ho's smile did not reach his eyes. "Protection is an expensive habit for a man in your position," he said. "Your father understood that sentiment is a liability. I had hoped his son had inherited more than his face." "My father is dead," Jae-sun said, "because men like you convinced him that cruelty was the same thing as strength. I do not intend to make the same mistake, and I do not intend to explain myself further to a man who has already decided he wants my seat." The room's temperature seemed to drop, and Amara, watching from beside the door exactly where Jae-sun had positioned her with a clear line to the exit, understood that whatever calm words were being exchanged, this conversation had already tipped past the point of peaceful resolution. Sung-ho's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket with a speed that suggested this meeting had never been intended to end in words at all, and Amara, who had spent 2 weeks learning to read the room the way Jae-sun did, saw the movement a half-second before Jae-sun did, and threw the heavy glass ashtray from the side table directly into the space between Sung-ho's hand and his jacket, disrupting his aim just enough that the shot that followed went wide, embedding itself in the wall instead of Jae-sun's chest. What followed was fast and brutal, Jae-sun closing the distance before Sung-ho could recover his balance, and Amara, rather than retreating through the door Jae-sun had positioned her near, grabbed the heavy wooden chair beside her and swung it into the knees of the second guard rushing toward Jae-sun's exposed back, buying the same crucial half-second she had bought in the parking garage, the same decisive action that refused to let her stand still while someone she loved fought for both their lives. When it ended, Sung-ho lay disarmed and defeated on the floor, his ambition dismantled as thoroughly as his aim had been, and Jae-sun turned to find Amara standing with the broken chair leg still in her hand, breathing hard, her eyes fierce and steady in a way that told him everything he needed to know about the woman standing in front of him. "You keep doing that," he said, closing the distance between them.
"Doing what?" she said.
"Refusing to be a woman who simply waits to be saved," he said, and there was something in his voice that had never been there when he spoke to anyone else, something unguarded and entirely without armor. "I told you already," Amara said. "That's not who I am." He reached for her then, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that felt like the opposite of everything that had just happened in this room, and he said her name the way he had never said it before, stripped of the careful distance he'd maintained even after the truth had set them both free to want what they wanted. "Amara."
Just that.
Just her name, spoken like something he had been waiting his whole life to have the right to say, and she understood, standing in the wreckage of a room that had nearly cost them both everything, that whatever this was between them, it had never once been about a ring or a mother's secret or a truth that took 2 weeks to untangle. It had always simply been this, two people who recognized something true in each other before either of them fully understood why. The organization settled in the weeks that followed, Sung-ho's ambitions dismantled along with a small faction of loyalty he had managed to build, and Jae-sun rebuilt the trust of the men beneath him with the same careful precision he brought to everything, proving through action rather than declaration that the empire had not softened simply because its leader had finally allowed himself to want something outside of it. Amara did not disappear into that world entirely, did not trade a diner apron for a life she had never asked for, but she also did not walk away from what had grown between them in the space of a few dangerous, transformative weeks. She kept her job at Della's, because the diner had never been the problem, and because she liked the particular independence of earning her own way, but she also kept Jae-sun, in the sense that mattered most, choosing him each day with the same clear-eyed deliberateness she brought to everything else in her life. Her mother, Vivian, took longer to trust the shape of this new and unexpected chapter, but even she softened eventually, watching her daughter build something honest out of a truth that had once nearly destroyed them both, watching Jae-sun return again and again, not out of obligation but out of a choice he made freely, every single time. On a quiet evening months later, Jae-sun found Amara in her small apartment kitchen, and he set something on the counter beside her without a word, a small velvet box she recognized before she opened it. Inside was not a wedding ring, not yet, not something so final and declarative, but a smaller version of the ring he still wore, the black stone smaller, the engraving simplified but unmistakably matched to his. "It is not a proposal," he said, watching her face carefully. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight or even this year. I am asking you to wear something that marks you as mine in the way that matters to my world, so that no one who sees it will ever again mistake what you are to me." Amara turned the ring over in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, understanding exactly what it meant to a man who came from a world where symbols carried the weight of law. "And what happens," she said, "when I decide I want more than a symbol? Then you will ask me," he said, "and I will already know the answer before you finish the question." She slid the ring onto her finger, feeling it settle there the way certain truths settle once finally spoken aloud, undeniable and permanent, and entirely her own choice. And outside the window the evening light moved gold across the small kitchen table, the same light that had once fallen across a diner booth where a spilled cup of coffee had cracked open 22 years of silence and revealed, underneath it all, something neither of them had known they were looking for.